Welcome back to the Deep Dive, the only place where we take your pile of articles, research, and analysis, that information overload you just don't have time for, and transform it into knowledge you can immediately use.
Today, we are exploring a geopolitical phenomenon that really felt like it was ripped straight from the 19th century.
Yeah, we're talking about this startling, explicit resurgence of American territorial expansionism.
It's an incredibly important deep dive, especially for you, the listener, who wants to understand just how quickly foreign policy norms can shift. I mean, our sources reveal this clear, deliberate move starting late 2024.
A move by the second Trump administration, pivoting away from decades of relying on, traditional diplomatic alliances.
Right, and instead focusing on active, outright territorial acquisition, a policy concept many people, I think, believed was completely obsolete.
Absolutely. Our source material chronicles the administration's ambitious, and I think we can say highly controversial, quest for not one, but two distinct, geographically crucial areas.
We are talking, of course, about Greenland, the strategic gateway to the Arctic.
And the Panama Canal, the historical choke point of global trade. The mission laid out in these documents is clear. We need to detail the specific policy actions taken, the profound geopolitical motivations behind these moves, driven by national security and economic control, and the intense international resistance they generated.
And not just from adversaries, but critically, from long-established allies like Denmark. That's what's so shocking here.
This narrative is far more than just some real estate negotiation or a historical throwback.
Not at all. It is fundamentally about challenging the existing international norms established since World War II.
Specifically those surrounding state sovereignty, the prohibition of force.
And critically, the right to self-determination for indigenous populations. I mean, the friction we see here is just profound.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting north with the Arctic and what the administration called the Greenland Gambit.
What's fascinating here is that the idea of the U.S. owning Greenland, it feels like a sudden political stunt to many people.
Right, it just sort of came out of nowhere in the news.
Exactly. But our historical sources show us it's actually a revival of a deep-seated, century-old strategic concept. It has profound historical echoes.
That historical context is so essential because it shows this wasn't just some arbitrary decision.
Yeah.
We see the American interest in acquiring Greenland dating all the way back to the 19th century. There are documented internal discussions in 1867 and then again in 1910.
And that 1910 idea was particularly bizarre, wasn't it? A proposal to swap the Philippines' territories of Mindanao and Palawan for Greenland and the Danish West Indies.
I mean, just an enormous territorial trade idea. It's almost unimaginable today. The interest even resurfaced again in 1955, right at the height of the Cold War.
But the most relevant precedent, the one the 2025 administration seemed keen to reference, is that 1946 proposal made by President Truman's administration.
Okay, so post-World War II.
Right. The U.S. had established a strong military foothold there, and Washington, citing military necessity in the emerging nuclear age, decided to make a very serious, albeit secret, offer to Denmark.
And this was not a small sum of money.
Not at all.
The sources detail that the U.S. offered $100 million in gold bullion for the island.
Which, adjusted for inflation, you're talking about roughly $1 billion today. A significant offer.
Secretary of State James F. Burns delivered this offer to the Danish Foreign Minister, Gustav Rasmussen, in December 1946.
And his argument was that a sale would be, and I'm quoting here, the most clean-cut and satisfactory solution. It would also relieve Denmark of the costly burden of supporting the territory.
So it was framed as a favor, in a way.
In a way, yes. But Rasmussen, to his credit, was firm in his rejection. And his response, it just offers this beautiful illustration of the diplomatic tightrope walk of that post-war era.
What did he say?
He acknowledged that, and this is a great quote, "While we owe much to America, I do not feel that we owe them the whole island of Greenland."
A polite but very firm declaration.
Exactly. Gratitude for wartime protection did not equate to transferring territorial sovereignty.
So the acquisition failed. But the strategic necessity didn't go away. This led to a transition, right? From a kind of colonial interest to a strategic partnership.
That's right. The sources confirm the initial defense pact was signed by the Danish ambassador in Washington in 1941 during the German occupation of Denmark, which allowed the U.S. base rights.
And that arrangement was later formalized.
It was. Into the 1951 Defense of Greenland Agreement, which is still the legal basis for the relationship today. And while this agreement explicitly affirmed Danish sovereignty, it granted the U.S. sweeping authority to operate defense areas for NATO purposes.
So the U.S. essentially got all the benefits of military access and basing rights.
Without the political burden of actually administering the population. Although, as one Danish scholar pointed out later, Denmark's sovereignty during the Cold War was almost fictional. The U.S. held significant de facto control.
Which brings us directly to the modern renewal of this push. And the sources are unanimous on this point.
They are. The drive today is dictated by clear geopolitical imperatives, making Greenland the ultimate gateway to the Arctic.
The strategic value in the 2020s is arguably higher than at any point since the peak of the Cold War.
Absolutely. And this is due to the convergence of climate change and great power competition. The first critical point is its geographical dominance over the GI-UK gap. That's the Greenland-Iceland-United Kingdom gap.
And for those of our listeners who might be unfamiliar with naval strategy, this gap is much more than just a name on a map.
Oh, it is the crucial choke point in the North Atlantic.
Okay.
Control of the GIU cap is absolutely vital for NATO's maritime and anti-submarine warfare efforts. If you control Greenland, you control the ability to monitor and prevent the Russian Northern Fleet from entering the wider North Atlantic.
And this region is heating up again, strategically.
It is, very rapidly, due to advancements in Russian submarine capabilities and the reestablishment of their Arctic bases. If NATO's surveillance capacity there is compromised, the naval balance across the entire North Atlantic shifts dramatically in favor of Russia.
And the land-based presence is equally critical for defense technology. We're talking about Pacific Space Base.
Correct. Patuffik, which used to become Thule Air Base, is the absolute linchpin of American ballistic missile early warning.
So it's our eye in the sky, looking over the pole.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
It supports missile warning, missile defense, and crucial space surveillance operations for both the U.S. and for NATO. Its northerly location gives it this unparalleled view of the polar region.
And the sources highlight its uniqueness, right?
They do. It's one of only 2 Arctic facilities available to the U.S. Space Force for consistent tracking and control of polar orbiting satellites. Those are the satellites essential for high-fidelity communications, imagery, weather monitoring.
So losing it or having it compromised would be a huge problem.
It would create a major national security blind spot for the U.S. and its allies.
So the administration's argument for outright acquisition pivots entirely on this idea that Denmark, as the sovereign power, is somehow incapable of providing the necessary security.
That's the core policy justification put forward.
That U.S. control is the only foolproof solution to counter Russia and China.
Exactly. The administration cites Russia aggressively restoring its Soviet-era military bases and expanding its combat capabilities across the Arctic. And they argue those capabilities far exceed those currently maintained by the United States.
And then there's the China factor.
Right. The Chinese factor has complicated the entire region. China's 2018 declaration of itself as a near-Arctic state, combined with its active pursuit of a polar Silk Road, has raised immense alarm bells in Washington.
So the official argument became that U.S. control is necessary to prevent Greenland from falling into the orbit of these adversaries.
Particularly through strategic infrastructure investment, yes.
It sounds like the motivation is dual purpose then. Military deterrence and, just as critically, economic control. The economic calculus here is immense.
The mineral wealth alone is enough to justify intense geopolitical interest.
But we're not just talking about oil and gas.
No. While Greenland is estimated to hold significant oil and gas deposits, the immediate strategic focus is on critical minerals and specifically rare earth elements.
And the numbers are staggering.
The sources state that Greenland possesses something like 1.5 million metric tons of rare earth minerals. In the global technological race, that is highly, highly strategic.
We hear the term rare earths a lot, but just for the layperson, why are they so central to national security?
It's because of their unique magnetic and conductive properties. They are not just for, consumer high-tech gadgets like your phone.
Right.
They are absolutely essential components for specialized magnets used in electric vehicle motors, massive wind turbines, and most critically, high-tech weaponry.
That she has.
The guidance systems and precision missiles, the advanced radar of the F-35 fighter jet. The problem is that China currently dominates the global supply chain. It controls over 80% of the world's processing capacity.
So the U.S. views Greenland as this massive opportunity to secure domestic access.
To secure access to 39 of the 50 minerals, the Pentagon has classified as critical to national security and thereby challenged China's near monopoly.
And this desire to secure a Western-controlled source, it translated into very real, concrete diplomatic and economic pressure even before the second term began.
Absolutely. The sources point specifically to the Kvanefjeld rare earth deposit, one of the largest in the world outside of China.
And what happened there?
In 2024, American and Danish officials applied immense pressure on the developer, a company called Tanbreeze Mining, specifically directing them not to sell the project to Chinese developers.
So they intervened directly in a commercial deal.
They did. This geoeconomic pressure ultimately led to Tanbreeze selling the project to a U.S. firm, Critical Metals, reportedly at a lower price than what the Chinese had offered.
That just demonstrates that strategic national security concerns explicitly trumped free market forces in this Arctic mineral race.
It's a perfect example.
And finally, we cannot overlook the long-term sort of futuristic potential encapsulated in this phrase, Panama Canal of the North.
That phrase perfectly summarizes the potential economic prize. Policymakers are betting that as climate change accelerates ice retreat, trans-Arctic shipping routes, primarily the Northwest Passage and the Transpolar Sea Route, will open up reliably.
Which would reduce the need for longer routes, like the Suez Canal.
Drastically. It could cut transit times between Europe and Asia by weeks. And U.S. ownership of Greenland would place it in a dominant position to manage these newly opened waterways, enforce security, provide infrastructure,
And most importantly, collect significant transit-related revenues.
justifying the analogy to the Panama Canal's historical importance.
Exactly.
So Greenland becomes this convergence point of global missile defense, the global rare earth supply chain, and the future of international trade routes.
And that elevated the discussion from a curious territorial notion to what the administration's strategists called an absolute necessity.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the acquisition strategy wasn't just, high-level policy papers and diplomatic overtures.
No, it became a uniquely public, multi-pronged campaign, combining almost cartoonishly shallow public relations, aggressive legislative maneuvering, and eventually hard coercion against a NATO ally.
That juxtaposition is key. After President Trump renewed his proposal in December 2024, describing ownership as an absolute necessity, the administration immediately launched this high-profile hearts and minds influence campaign.
And this is far from formal State Department diplomacy.
Oh, to put it mildly, it was highly personalized, high visibility, and often, culturally jarring.
Let's start with the visit.
On January 7, 2025, Donald Trump Jr. arrived in Nuuk, Greenland's capital, aboard Trump Force One.
So right away, a very high-profile signal.
Yes. While it was officially framed as a personal visit by an outdoorsman to see the magnificent sights, politically it signaled a familial and political commitment that far exceeded the efforts of traditional diplomatic envoys.
And let's unpack the style of that visit, because the sources detail anecdotes that highlight a significant cultural disconnect.
The intention was clearly to win over the local population directly. The entourage, which included the Trump-affiliated social media content creators, the Nelk Boys,
Right.
engaged in direct public outreach. We see these stories of them handing out Meiji hats and notably U.S. dollar bills to locals.
Including an 11-year-old boy.
Yes, a move that was widely criticized as condescending or colonialist by the local Greenlandic media.
And the telephone luncheon was a particularly striking piece of political theater.
Indeed. Trump Jr. hosted a luncheon at a hotel where he had a telephone call with the president, who then spoke directly to local residents.
And the sources emphasize the nature of the attendees.
They do. It included vulnerable people, such as homeless individuals, and even, reportedly, a known Nuuk drug dealer. During this highly publicized call, the president proclaimed Greenland is a very special place and offered this personal, almost paternal promise that the United States would treat you well.
The message was direct. Forget Copenhagen. Look to Washington for your future prosperity.
That's it, exactly. And that strategy also actively used historical grievances to drive a wedge between Nuuk and Copenhagen.
A critical psychological maneuver.
It was. Trump Jr. publicly suggested that Danes were racist toward Greenlanders and treated them poorly, attempting to leverage the very real historical colonial tensions and economic disparities.
So the narrative was designed to make U.S. affiliation seem like a preferable alternative to continued Danish dependence.
Especially among Greenlanders who favor full independence, it tried to position the U.S. as a liberator, not a buyer.
And while all this public relations stuff was going on, there was very explicit legislative movement in Washington to signal seriousness.
And to prepare the legal ground for acquisition, we saw two pieces of legislation that really illustrate the political backing.
The first was the Make Greenland Great Again Act.
Yes, H.R. 361, introduced by Representative Andrew Ogles of Tennessee in January 2025. This bill was highly significant. It proposed establishing a formal 60-calendar-day congressional review period for any agreement reached between the U.S. and Denmark.
Wait, just 60 days. That timeline essentially circumvents the traditional treaty ratification process, which can take years and requires a two-thirds Senate vote.
Exactly. It aimed to fast-track annexation. If Congress did not enact a joint resolution of disapproval within that short time frame, the acquisition agreement would automatically take the full force of law.
So it completely flipped the script. It required explicit legislative opposition to stop it, rather than requiring explicit support to pass it.
A very clever and aggressive legislative move.
And then there was this symbolic push for rebranding.
Representative Buddy Carter's proposal, the Red, White, and Blue Land Act of 2025.
Right.
It aimed to rename the island upon acquisition, which showed the depth of political enthusiasm for integration. While less consequential, it underscored a readiness for full, immediate administrative control.
We also saw the administration's most senior incoming officials publicly throwing their weight behind the mission, making it non-negotiable from the start.
Yes, Vice President-elect J.D. Vance repeatedly emphasized throughout January 2025 that controlling Greenland was absolutely critical for U.S. national security.
And he insisted there was a deal to be made in Greenland.
This consistent, high-level messaging framed the acquisition as not merely desirable, but as a necessary precondition for American defense in the Arctic.
Then the tone shifted dramatically, moving from negotiation and soft influence to outright threats and coercion in early 2026.
And this followed a completely separate, high-stakes military action. The sources pinpoint this dramatic escalation following the U.S. military operation in Venezuela in early January 2026.
Which resulted in the capture of President Nicolas Maduro.
Right. And that action served as a very public demonstration of the administration's willingness to use unilateral military force abroad. It lent a terrifying credibility to the subsequent threats made against Denmark.
And the rhetoric immediately became explicit regarding Greenland. On January 4, 2026, the president stated his intentions publicly.
He announced that the U.S. needed Greenland for national security and that he would absolutely do something on Greenland whether they like it or not.
And crucially, he refused to rule out military force,
warning that if it wasn't done the easy way, we're going to do it the hard way. The fact that this was aimed at a founding NATO ally, it just stunned capitals across Europe.
The White House then doubled down on that shock.
They did. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt confirmed the severity of the threat just 2 days later, stating that utilizing the U.S. military is always an option at the commander-in-chief's disposal to achieve this national security priority.
And this was coupled with that social media post, right? The American flag draped over Greenland and the word soon.
Yes. European leaders interpreted this as a serious contemplation of military intervention against an ally.
It's remarkable that the administration threatened military action, but also constructed a parallel structure of economic pressure against Denmark.
The economic threat was the quieter, but perhaps equally devastating, coercion tool. Following a call on January 15, 2025, Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen confirmed that Trump had committed to applying punitive economic sanctions against Denmark until it acquiesced.
So she confirmed a threat directly.
She did. The Prime Minister noted Denmark was in a serious situation, facing potential damage to trade relationships. This demonstrated a willingness to weaponize economics against an ally simply to force a territorial concession.
To threaten a founding NATO ally with military force and economic ruin, what was the immediate impact on the alliance?
Well, the impact was immediate and profound. The Danish intelligence services later reflected this internal security crisis by taking the highly unusual step of classifying a Trump-led U.S. as a security risk.
A security risk to Denmark?
Specifically citing the U.S. tendency to use economic power to assert its will over allied nations. This signals a fundamental loss of trust and a deep reevaluation of the U.S. role in the European security architecture. It just fundamentally challenged the core premise of Article V.
It demonstrates that the campaign for control moved swiftly from diplomatic negotiation to an explicit policy of coercion, backed by threats of force, which destabilized the entire rule-based international order.
This raises an absolutely fundamental question. Why is buying or forcing the acquisition of Greenland so legally complicated in the 21st century?
Right.
And the core issue, as we touched on, is the legal principle of self-determination, which has completely superseded traditional concepts of territorial transfer.
Right. If we look back at the Louisiana Purchase or the 1917 sale of the Danish West Indies, which are now the U.S. Virgin Islands, territory was viewed as property.
Exactly, something
Yeah.
that could be ceded or sold by a sovereign ruler. But Greenland operates under a different, modern legal reality.
And this is where the legal architecture acts as a shield.
It does. Greenland is part of the Kingdom of Denmark, but operates under the extensive autonomy granted by the 2009 Self-Government Act. Under this framework, Greenlanders are explicitly recognized as a people under international law.
And that gives them rights over their land and their future status that simply didn't exist in 1917.
It does, and that designation is the ultimate checkmate because the act explicitly grants them a unilateral path to independence, and thus a veto over their future status.
Section 21 of that 2009 Act is the key legal instrument here, isn't it?
It is. It establishes that the decision on Greenland's independence must be made by the Greenlandic people. Any final agreement on a change in status, whether to independence or to a transfer, must have the consent of the Greenlandic parliament.
The Nazis are too.
Right. Must be approved by a public referendum in Greenland and still requires the final consent of the Danish parliament.
So it's a multi-layered lock.
It is. This legal mechanism transforms self-determination from a political ideal into an operative codified rule that prevents a simple bilateral sale.
So even if the Danish parliament had suddenly changed its mind and decided to accept the U.S. offer, legally, they couldn't separate the territory from the people who inhabit it without their consent.
Precisely. Modern international law, especially since the UN Charter, views the forcible or commercial acquisition of inhabited territory that disregards the people's will as legally invalid. Territory is no longer seen as alienable property like a piece of farmland.
So acquisition is legally impermissible without the freely expressed will of the Greenlandic population.
This structure essentially gives the people of Greenland a substantive veto power against any acquisition model that relies solely on an agreement between Washington and Copenhagen.
This inherent legal constraint explains the fierce Danish and Greenlandic resistance and why they were so unified in their rejection.
Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederikssen's consistency was vital. Her firm line was always, Greenland is not for sale. And when the U.S. threats escalated, she delivered the ultimate warning.
That's when she said it would end NATO.
She stated explicitly that an American military takeover of Greenland, a fellow NATO member, would mark the definitive end of the NATO alliance. That's just an extraordinary statement from a close ally.
And while the U.S. often argued that Denmark was too small to secure the Arctic, Denmark's actions prove they were willing to put serious money behind their claim of sovereignty.
The Danish commitment was substantial. Denmark announced a 14.6 billion kroner, that's about 2.3 billion US dollars agreement, to dramatically boost its Arctic security capabilities.
And this included new hardware.
Yes, a comprehensive plan for new Arctic naval vessels, long-range surveillance drones, and upgrading airports to handle their new F-35 fighter aircraft. This signals a serious, long-term commitment.
What about public opinion in Greenland itself? The polls seemed complex, on one hand against annexation, but on the other viewing the president as an opportunity.
That ambiguity is crucial to understanding the internal politics. A January 2025 poll confirmed that 85% of Greenlanders opposed U.S. annexation.
Which legally shuts down the idea.
It does. However, a deep ambivalence emerged. While 45% viewed the U.S. administration as a threat, a nearly equal 43% viewed the renewed U.S. interest as an opportunity.
So what's behind that?
It stems from the deep-seated desire among many Greenlanders for full independence. They hoped the increased U.S. interest and the resulting economic pressure on Denmark might serve as a bargaining chip against Copenhagen to achieve greater autonomy or desperately needed economic investment.
So using the U.S. as leverage.
Essentially, yes. Now, the diplomatic fallout didn't stop with Denmark. The U.S. actions triggered a crisis of cohesion across the entire alliance.
Right, that joint statement from the European nations.
Absolutely. Following the highly aggressive escalation of threats in January 2026, the leaders of 7 major European nations, Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Spain, and the UK, issued a powerful joint statement. They explicitly defended Greenland's sovereignty, stating clearly that the island belongs to its people.
That is a massive collective pushback.
The deepest crisis of cohesion within the Western Alliance since its founding, arguably. And the most profound long-term consequence of all this, as we discussed, was the intelligence fallout.
Which cannot be overstated.
No. When a key ally like Denmark's intelligence services officially classifies a friendly superpower, the nation that anchors NATO as a security risk, It signifies a total collapse of strategic trust.
And they cited the use of economic power to assert its will.
Exactly. This isn't just diplomatic disagreement. This is a fundamental and potentially permanent fracturing of the alliance security relationship.
Given all these legal and diplomatic roadblocks, what alternatives were realistically discussed for securing U.S. interests without resorting to acquisition or force?
The sources highlight a couple of non-acquisition alternatives. One was granting Greenland territorial status, similar to Guam.
Which was probably a non-starter politically?
Completely politically infeasible given the Greenlandic desire for independence. The second and far more feasible option was a compact of free association, or a COFA model.
And this model has been used before.
Yes, it's proven successful for the U.S., with Pacific nations like Micronesia and Palau. For listeners unfamiliar, a COFA isn't just about basing rights. It's a unique arrangement where the U.S. guarantees defense and provides massive, predictable, long-term financial assistance.
And in return?
In return, the U.S. receives exclusive rights to maintain military bases and veto security decisions made by that nation. Citizens of those nations also often get unique access to live, work, and study in the United States.
That level of integration sounds like it could satisfy both the Greenlandic need for investment and the U.S. need for control.
It was viewed as the most promising path. Greenlandic parliament members even suggested a tripartite COFA involving the U.S., Denmark, and Greenland.
And critics pointed out that the U.S. already has extensive access.
They do. The U.S. operates Pacific Space Base and can deploy troops under the 1951 agreement. The State Department noted back in 1955 that the U.S. was permitted to do almost anything, literally, that we want to, under existing agreements.
So it suggests enhanced strategic access via COFA was both legally viable and sufficient.
It did, which made people ask the question, was the administration truly seeking security, or was it sovereignty for sovereignty's sake?
So if the Greenland campaign was about acquiring a strategic position for the future, securing Arctic resources and new trade routes, the parallel expansionist objective focused on reclaiming a highly sensitive piece of history in our own hemisphere.
The Panama Canal Zone.
So what does this all mean for the U.S.'s relationship with Latin America?
The Panama Initiative, launched almost simultaneously, really demonstrated the global sweep of this expansionist ambition. In December 2024, President Trump demanded that Panama return control of the Panama Canal to the United States.
That demand carries a huge amount of historical baggage, doesn't it?
It does. The U.S. controlled the canal and the surrounding canal zone from 1903 until the handover was completed in 1999 under the Torrijos-Carter treaties. Taking control again would mark the first time the U.S. controlled Panamanian territory since the highly controversial 1989 U.S. invasion.
It's an explicit reversal of decades of diplomacy.
Decades of diplomacy designed to foster Panamanian national sovereignty.
Yes.
And the core justification for this demand initially focused on perceived economic mismanagement by Panama.
Right. It started with complaints about excessive rates.
Yes. But that quickly morphed into the central justification, countering perceived adversarial influence, specifically China. This mirrors the Greenland argument exactly.
How significant was the Chinese presence in the canal zone?
It was strategically significant enough to raise alarms in Washington. The sources note that the Hong Kong-based company C.K. Hutchison was managing 2 of the canal's 5 ports, Balboa and Cristobal.
Which are critical access points.
Very critical. Furthermore, CCP General Secretary Xi Jinping had explicitly integrated the canal into his Belt and Road Initiative. This led to senators, during hearings in early 2025, raising grave national security concerns about China potentially monitoring or disrupting American military and commercial shipments.
The administration swiftly backed up its demands with open threats of both military action and coercive force.
The threats were immediate and public, designed to pressure the Panamanian government. On January 7, 2025, President Trump stated he had not ruled out the use of military force to take control.
Then he followed that up in February.
He did, warning of a powerful U.S. action to take back the canal, using rhetoric that amplified the security concerns, claiming China was running the Panama Canal and we're going to take it back.
And this rhetoric moved quickly from the political stage to the actual Defense Department.
It did. The Pentagon was immediately tasked with planning. In March 2025, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth instructed the administration to immediately present credible military options.
To ensure fair and unfettered U.S. military and commercial access.
Correct. A month later, during a visit to Panama, Hegseth suggested the U.S. could revive military bases there, despite the Panamanian defense minister having previously rejected the idea.
This sounds like the administration was serious about using force, but the sources indicate the immediate goal regarding Chinese influence was achieved through financial coercion, not military action.
And that is the most fascinating hybrid outcome. Just weeks after the public threats and military planning began, a massive financial transaction occurred in March 2025.
The BlackRock deal.
The American investment company BlackRock announced a consortium buy of C.K. Hutchison's 80% holding in the port operations at both ends of the canal. This was a direct, swift win for the U.S. strategic objective.
And the timing and circumstances strongly suggest this was forced.
Reports noted that the Hong Kong-based Lee family, who owned C.K. Hutchison, felt under political pressure to exit the ports business. Discussions with BlackRock had begun only a few weeks prior, coinciding directly with the start of the Trump administration and its aggressive rhetoric.
It's a textbook example of using the threat of state power to achieve an economic objective.
It's empire building via hostile corporate takeover. It reduces Chinese commercial control without ever having to fire a shot or formally breach Panamanian territorial sovereignty.
This expansionist push nationally led to fierce, immediate Panamanian resistance on the ground.
The public sentiment was profoundly hostile and immediate. Protests erupted across Panama in late 2024. For Panamanians, the canal is viewed as central to their national identity and hard-won sovereignty.
And the polls reflected that.
They did. A poll in April 2025 showed 81% preferred the Panama Canal Authority managing the canal, compared to only 16% supporting U.S. government control.
And President Jose Raul Mulino held a firm diplomatic line against the threats.
Mulino flatly rejected the demands, stating clearly that the sovereignty and independence of Panama are not negotiable. Panamanian trade union leaders were equally vocal. The historical wounds of U.S. intervention run deep there.
The final, complex development was the joint security deal signed in April 2025, which, similar to the COFA discussions in Greenland, allowed the U.S. to achieve strategic access without formal acquisition.
The agreement was a crucial compromise. It allowed U.S. troops to be deployed to Panama, provided the Panamanian government explicitly consented to each deployment.
So it offered a middle ground, satisfying the U.S. desire for increased security access while technically respecting Panamanian sovereignty.
Technically. But the local political reaction suggests many Panamanians did not see it as a compromise at all.
Far from it.
The security deal was immediately and vehemently condemned by Panamanian politicians and trade union leaders alike. They protested against the signing, calling it a setback to national sovereignty, a camouflaged invasion, and an act of treason.
The opposition leader, Ricardo Lombana, called it an invasion without firing a shot.
That quote says it all. It illustrates how the strategic game for the U.S. increased military presence and access came at the high cost of deepening the delegitimization of the Panamanian government in the eyes of its own citizens.
And how did China, having just lost control of the ports, weigh in on this situation?
Predictably, Chinese officials framed the U.S. actions as overtly hegemonic. The Chinese embassy in Panama accused the administration of blackmailing Panama with repeated threats of seizing the Panama Canal solely to diminish Chinese influence.
They called it a fabrication.
A Chinese foreign ministry spokesman argued the U.S. had fabricated the lie of China controlling the Panama Canal merely as an excuse to push forward its own expansionist, Monroe Doctrine-style hegemonic agenda.
And that language is designed to resonate across Latin America.
Absolutely. It's language where the Monroe Doctrine is historically seen as justification for U.S. intervention and dominance. If we connect this back to the bigger picture, the core takeaway from this deep dive is clear. The administration aggressively prioritized a strategy of explicit expansionism.
Driven by perceived national security needs, securing the Arctic, the GIUK gap, and the canal and resource control, like those critical rare earth minerals and global trade routes.
Right. And this impulse fundamentally clashed with the existing international order, leading to these severe crises within NATO and in Central America.
It was a confrontation between a 19th century mindset, which viewed land as fungible property to be purchased or conquered,
and 21st century international law, where sovereignty is constrained by the right of popular self-determination.
and the legal and diplomatic architecture ultimately contained the most aggressive impulses.
It did. The prohibition on the use of force against an ally, coupled with the consolidation of the right of popular self-determination, exemplified by Greenland's 2009 Act, meant that outright territorial acquisition, whether by purchase or military force, was rendered legally and politically untenable.
So the expansionist push arguably failed to acquire territory outright, given Denmark's firm rejection and the Panamanian public's resistance to foreign control.
But, and this is a huge but, it absolutely succeeded in shifting strategic control through less messy but equally coercive means.
Like the economic pressure that forced the BlackRock consortium to buy the Panamanian port holdings from the Chinese firm.
And the overwhelming strategic pressure that led to enhanced security agreements like the Panama troop deployment deal and the serious discussions around a Greenland COFA.
It seems the ultimate outcome was a hybrid form of expansionism, using 19th century rhetoric and 21st century economic leverage to achieve the same aims. So the final provocative thought for you to mull over as you conclude your deep dive is this. If formal conquest and outright purchase are legally obsolete in the modern era, is this strategic dominance achieved through explicit threats of force and overwhelming economic pressure to restructure ownership and security rights, the new face of expansionism?
It looks like the same objective achieved through less legally messy, though equally coercive, means that bypass the need for actual territory. An interesting question of tactics versus ultimate aims, to be sure.
Well, and one that forces us to redefine what empire looks like today.
Absolutely.
Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive. We hope this has given you profound insight into a truly unique and tumultuous period of foreign policy. We'll see you next time.